Ladies and gentlemen, today on the program, my reflections on Kiss as the 50-year psycho circus comes to an end. It's kind of a weird semi-nostalgia from somebody whose primary experience of Kiss is from that 80s unmasked era. I think it's fun. I think it's kind of interesting, and we'll get to it on the other side. Hello, you're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. The thing about being in a costume band, especially a costume band with masks or with face paint, is that you never have to get old. That is why Kiss in 2023 can more or less be Kiss in 1975. The illusion remains intact, and in a certain sense, time can seem to stand still for bands like that, where other bands, as we are finding out, age and perhaps diminish, leaving their audiences sometimes pining for how it used to be. And I wonder now, as I sit here on Manic Monday morning recording this episode, I wonder if that's what Kiss had in mind when they donned the face paint 5 freaking decades ago, man. I wonder if they thought at that point in time they were embarking on a 50-year career that would turn them, particularly in the 1970s, into an absolute pop culture phenomenon. Kiss, man. Stadium gigs, lunchboxes, comic books, the whole shebang, And that's how we think of Kiss, is it not? Those of us, the few I suppose, who still think about Kiss at all, which is more of us than there probably normally are at this moment, because the band played their final show at Madison Square Garden last weekend. Kids, the makeup hides a lot. But alas, time makes cracks beneath the face paint and the tights. I have never been the biggest Kiss fan, okay, but I think that's probably a product of timing. I was too young for the 1970s heyday, and that's kind of the point for me right now. Kiss, in a weird way, is kind of like Queen Elizabeth to me. They were just always part of the world that I live in. Kiss played their first show before I was born. They debuted at the Popcorn Club in Queens, New York in January of 1973, and I debuted pretty much exactly 9 months later in September of 1973. So Kiss has literally existed for my entire life. And those of us of a certain age think of Kiss as that stadium band with the pyro and the spitting blood and the breathing fire and that whole thing, man. A couple weekends ago, I went to the local vintage arcade, which is a place I love to go, by the way. This arcade in L-Town that is nothing but vintage games and pinball machines from back in the day, man. You step through those doors, and it's as though you're a freaking teenager again. And of course, they have a Kiss pinball machine. And there are the 4 characters, the original Kiss lineup in the makeup. And they are on the backboard of that pinball machine, all larger than life, all lit up, as we think of Kiss, man. But the reality is, it was not always that way. All right, Kiss, like everybody else, had to come up through the freaking ranks, man. That first show at the Popcorn Club in Queens, New York had fewer than 10 people at it. Kiss was a band just like everybody else, you know, and the early days of the band, even after they got signed, were not all that great. All right, Kiss, as I said, they had to come up like every other band. And so here they are, In the early days of their career, even after they got signed, they got records out, but it's not doing that well. All right. Kiss records did not sell that well in the early days. And so there they are, like every other young, hungry band, driving around in the station wagon, going town to town, gig to gig, having to do the makeup, having to do the whole thing. It reminds me, of course, of those early days of Ghost, where they're touring at the same level, playing club shows, trying to do it in the full regalia with as much of a stage show as they have the time and permission and space and money to do. Kiss is doing that too, driving around in the 70s in a freaking station wagon, eating crap food because it's all they could afford. This is a signed label band, man. The money's not there. They are not selling records, all right? Those first Kiss records did almost nothing in terms of sales, did almost nothing in terms of singles, did almost nothing in terms of charting, and it was really, really a difficult time for them. And so it is since time immemorial for your touring rock bands, man, having to be out there on the grind. And it's always kind of interesting for me to think about a band like Kiss, because we think of them now with such a huge, elaborate spectacle of a show. And that's what Kiss has always been about, man. Over the freaking top. But here they are in the station wagon driving around. And I don't know if they played clubs like I've played that didn't have green rooms. Like, where are you going to put that makeup on? Looking in the mirror behind the sunshade in the station wagon, I don't know. Having to hold on to this vision, it's hard enough, right? It's hard enough when you are a band that is such a spectacle, even at a successful level. Ghost gets crapped on today by people who just aren't into the whole image and the costumes and all that stuff. They call it fake or whatever. And Tobias Forge laughs all the way to the bank because Ghost is crushing it. And so it was for Kiss, which are playing these little clubs to a handful of people and you're coming out looking like you do, and it seems kind of strange. There's this extra layer of confidence, I think, that has to come if you're going to put on such a show as a band that's nobody from nowhere, playing to people who have never heard of you. That's hard to do, man. That is difficult to do. And that is Kiss in the early days, even releasing albums, not selling them, not charting, not doing well with singles. And there was a point in time, believe it or not, there was a point in time when Kiss almost didn't make it. All right, mid-70s, they got a few records out, and the records are just not selling all that well, right? And they're getting some pretty good tours in terms of opening for people. Like, they're playing in front of audiences, but the albums are not really selling. But a funny thing is happening. What is selling is the live show, and that has always been Kiss, has it not? The huge live show, the spectacle. It's an entertainment thrill ride, Kiss. I've never seen Kiss live, believe it or not, but we all know the legend of the Kiss live show. And so here we come to the mid-1970s. Kiss is on the edge of bankrupt. Their label, Casablanca Records, also on the edge of bankrupt. Things are not looking good, man. And if they do not score some kind of hit at some point very, very soon, the whole thing is going to go under. And so they're looking around like, we're not selling records. Something is wrong with our records. But what's happening is the shows are selling like mad. And so even though nobody's buying the albums, they're looking out from behind the curtain every night and the places are sold out. People are going nuts. People are lined up down the street to see the Kiss show. And they're like, okay, the reality is we're a live band. All right. We are a live band, and that is where we really shine, and that is what the people want. And our records are not translating that live vibe that really pulls people in. What they're hearing on the albums is not super representative of what we actually are, which is just a big spectacle live band. And so they get it in their heads that what they're going to do is release a live album. We're going to release something that actually captures the true essence of this band. And so they release, we can say now, infamously, Kiss Alive. And that record freaking explodes because the true power, the true magnificence of Kiss in the 1970s, that live show, finally gets translated for people to hear on record. And Kiss Alive becomes a massive, massive hit. Big money for the band, big money for the label, and it skyrockets. It just shoots Kiss into the next stratosphere. And they become, by the late 1970s, as I said, a pop culture phenomenon. They become a merchandise machine. I mean, Kiss is everywhere. The lunchboxes, comic books, they're making Kiss movies. Kiss meets the Phantom in the Park. Kiss is everywhere. And of course, they have their detractors. People who see this whole dang thing as nothing but a gimmick. And Gene Simmons, like Tobias Forge, laughs all the way to the freaking bank. The huge spectacle, the world catches up with what's in Gene's and Paul's minds, I suppose. And Kiss becomes this huge, huge thing off the back of the release of this Kiss Alive record. Now, I'm just a tiny boy when this is happening. I did not really come online musically until probably the early 80s, right? So I missed all of this stuff, and that is why I'm not a huge Kiss fan. If you're going to be my age and be a really big Kiss fan, the chances are good that you had an older sibling or some influence in your life who was a teenager when this was happening and jumped on board with the Kiss phenomenon and handed that down to you. My older siblings, not big Kiss fans, okay? My introduction to Kiss came at around 83, 84 probably 84 with the Animalize record. All right, now what happened with the band was by the late 1970s, they're this huge thing. There's always going to be, I think, a backlash to whatever becomes the huge thing. And we're talking huge here, man. We are talking just huge, ubiquitous. This band is everywhere. And it's a machine at that point in time. There's always going to be a backlash to that. And credit to Kiss. A lot of people want to bag on them musically. I like Kiss. I've always liked the music. A lot of people don't like it. A lot of people can't separate the music from the image or their perception of, let's say, Gene Simmons. And they experimented, though. Like, they did things like Music from the Elder, these records that were somewhat experimental that messed around with things, and they released some albums that just didn't do that well towards the late 70s into the early 80s. And in a weird way, the buzz kind of went off them. Released some albums that didn't do that well. People maybe started getting tired of the shtick a little bit. Anything that is that in your face is eventually going to grate on you, I think, in some way. And so there remained the Kiss Army. But I think as a cultural phenomenon, people began to get just a little bit tired of Kiss being everywhere. You can't keep going to the same well and expect to be able to drink, You have to evolve. And so that's what they did, right? A couple albums didn't do too well. Things are beginning to drop off. They're not selling like they used to. And it's like, we need to make a change here. And so what Kiss does in the early 80s, of course, is they take off the face paint, right? They evolve with the times and they appear unmasked. And that doesn't go great either, by the way, initially. A lot of their fans are like, what happened to Kiss? One of the things that drew people to these characters was this larger than life quality that they had. It's like professional wrestlers, It's like when The Undertaker, who appears in the WWE towards the end of the kind of cartoon era, and he appears as this supernatural, really overwhelming kind of presence, this spookiness, this immortality, the dead man. He has this character, and there's just this vibe, this essence that follows him. And then you fast forward to the 90s, and all of a sudden, he's that American badass character. and he's wearing like a denim vest and a bandana like everybody else. It's like it's not the same anymore. And then people pine for the return of the real Undertaker, which happens later. And so it goes with Kiss. So they take off all the face paint, they take off the whole thing, and now they kind of morph into, throughout the 80s, what becomes kind of just another glam metal band. And a lot of their fans did not like that one bit, man. And so in the early days of Unmasking, it didn't work all that great. But then they released Lick It Up, and they had a couple of MTV hits off of Lick It Up. And that started the ball rolling again just a little bit, all right? And that introduced the band to a new generation of fans. Now, we all know what it's like to contemplate the music of 10 years ago, especially a band that's as cartoonish as Kiss. I think a lot of people 10 years later coming up were like, that's a different generation's music. That's weird, goofy stuff. And we like the new stuff, which is more serious. Poison. Motley Crue, stuff that doesn't look goofy, right? I think there was just this younger generation turning their backs on the older generation stuff. And so Kiss morphs into something that looks much more like an 80s hard rock band. And a lot of their fans did not like that. But a lot of new fans came on board. And my first my first introduction to the band came from the Animalize record. It was my neighbor, who didn't grow up in the kind of ecclesiastical wonderland that I did. He had the Van Halen, he had the 1984 record, and he had Twisted Sister when Stay Hungry was happening and Twisted Sister was huge. And he had Animalize. And so I was listening to songs like Heaven's on Fire, that sort of thing. And that sent a ripple through the church, man. And that was my other introduction to Kiss. I had the music from my neighbor, and then, as I've talked about before on this program, we had the dangers and evils of rock music at youth night at church, right? They'd do that once annually. They'd play Beatles records backwards, and they'd talk about Black Sabbath, and they'd talk about AC/DC, that evil little man with the horns on his head, and they'd talk about Iron Maiden and this kind of stuff, right? All the stuff that's going to make you turn into a Satanist, including Kiss. And they'd quote Bible verses, and then they'd show Kiss on the screen. And I look back, retrospectively, and I laugh so freaking hard. I laugh so hard at what they thought was dangerous. Like, you really think Gene Simmons is dangerous? You really think this cartoon band is dangerous? Really? But there was this weird hysteria in the 80s, man, about all this stuff. And it wasn't just in the church, right? It was the parental advisory stickers. It was Judas Priest. It was Dee Snider in front of the Senate House Committee or whatever that was. There was this pandemonium in the 80s. And of course, the church does pandemonium better than anybody does. And so I had these warring things going on where I really liked Animalize. I was a rock music fan from the second I heard rock music, man. And I like some of those Kiss albums from the 80s, all right? Again, I missed the heyday. I had no allegiance to what Kiss was in the 70s. I was not there. I was alive, but I was not there. All right, I came online in the 80s, and I heard songs like I've Had Enough, Into the Fire, and Heaven's on Fire. And then from the Asylum record, Tears Are Falling. Tears Are Falling is great. And that classic that hit the heart of the issues. This is Kiss at their political best, which is from Asylum, All Night. Let us read from the Book of Kiss. Everywhere around the world, everybody's doing time. Freedom comes at 5:15, prison starts at 8:45. It takes a hard-working lover to keep on towing the line. I'll meet you under the covers. I get excited. I'm so excited. Well, we work all day and we don't know why, but there's just one thing that money can't buy. When your body's been starved, feed your appetite. When you work all day, you gotta, all night. Woo. And if that doesn't hit you, kids, I don't know what will. You gotta all night when you work all day. That is Kiss at their finest. When I was a 15-year-old kid, I was a 14-year-old kid. That was just a great song, man. You know, Steel Panther came along all these years later, did the same sort of thing, made a joke out of it. And I don't know, man, Kiss has never been cited for their deep and insightful lyrics. But I liked a lot of Kiss's music that was released in the 80s, man. But a lot of the fans from the 70s weren't into that stuff at all. And this is what happens, you know, you move out of an era. Once you kind of leave high school, in a weird way, for a lot of us, you don't keep up with what came later, you know? And so it is with Kiss. And they went through the 80s, not always doing that well, okay? Animalized sold well, that's a platinum record. I think Asylum did okay. But then they got just kind of mashed in with every other glam metal band in the scene. And they were still Kiss, but they were not larger than life Gods of Thunder anymore. They were just another hair metal band playing, even though they made great records. And I think they are in some ways underrated, all right? Paul Stanley, when Paul Stanley was at his best, when he was in his prime, a phenomenal rock singer. Phenomenal rock singer, okay? I mean, everybody thinks so hard about Gene Simmons, you know, because he is such a force of personality. He has made himself that way that a lot of people think of Kiss and they think immediately of Gene Simmons. And a lot of people will kind of roll their eyes about whether he's a good bass player or not. I'm not qualified to say. I think he wrote some great songs. I think that whole band wrote some great songs. And I think Paul Stanley is severely underrated as a vocalist. There's a video I watched. I watch it every now and again. And this is mid-80s. I think they're probably touring on Asylum. And they look like every other glam metal band. And they're playing some festival. And they're singing Tears Are Falling. And that's a demanding song, all right? Paul Stanley had a very, very high voice. And he hit a lot of very, very high notes with full freaking power. And he's singing Tears Are Falling, and he's just crushing it. He is nailing it, man. And I know that he's come under scrutiny in the past 5 or 6 years for probably / possibly lip syncing to tracks. I wonder how much that's happening in the world. I really do more and more wonder how much that's happening in the world. And I find that very disappointing, especially as concert ticket prices go up, 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 up. It's like if I just wanted to hear the CD, I'd stay home and hear the CD, man. I don't know. I know he's come under fire for that sort of thing lately. I don't know how much of it's true. Probably some, because think about it. Listen to some of that stuff from the 80s and the 70s. It's so high. But if you listen to him performing in the 80s, he's nailing all of it, man. Paul Stanley was freaking great. He really, really was. And I don't think he gets enough credit. And I liked a lot of that stuff. But so it went through the 80s. Kiss sometimes not doing all that well. But then sometimes doing well. You know, it kind of went up and down for them, I think. And we come to the end of the decade, into the early 90s. And I don't know if Gene and Paul kind of saw the writing on the wall for the whole glam thing, or if just enough time had passed and their hardcore original fans from the 70s had reached an age whereby they could plug back into music a little bit. I think Gene and Paul were reading the tea leaves. I think they saw that the glam thing was on its way out. This grunge thing was coming in. And how are we going to cope with that? All right. The biggest bands of the hair metal, the glam metal genre, your Motleys, the Crues, your Def Leppards, all of those bands, even at the highest level, were beginning to become passé, right? Vince Neil left Motley Crue, Def Leppard after Hysteria. You know, the record sales begin to tail off because the new kids, again, it was that generation shift. The same generation that turned away from Kiss in costumes, the next generation turned away from the glam metal scene. I think Kiss saw that coming. It's like, what are we going to do here? We can't go backwards. Gene Simmons does not do backwards. And so they'd make the decision in the middle 1990s, we're going to get the band back together. Now, we know famously that the original drummer Peter Criss, the original lead player Ace Frehley, had long ago been either excommunicated from or had stepped away from Kiss. We had different members come in, whatever. Paul and Gene remain steadfast, the members of Kiss. It's like there's not a whole lot of interest in what we're doing right now. Kiss as a brand, Kiss as a phenomenon, kind of ending, What are we going to do? Well, let's get the original lineup back together. Let's put the makeup on. Let's be Kiss again. And by that point, 20 years later, there's an appetite for Kiss again. And I think maybe mid-90s, there was an appetite for big rock shows again. I think the grunge thing, yeah, a lot of those bands played to big crowds. Pearl Jam played to big crowds, man, but the spectacle was not the same, all right? And that was very deliberate. Grunge had a different aesthetic. Grunge had a different approach. And I think there was an appetite, especially among probably older music fans, for the big show. And enough time had passed that those kids who were 16 in 1975, by 1995, they're 36. They're poking up on 40. Maybe they're feeling just a little bit of pining for their lost youth. Let's take the ride again. And so you can trot out the original Kiss lineup in the Kiss makeup, and they look, as I said, like 1975 because of the face paint, because of wigs, because of whatever. You take the bands from my era, mid to late 80s, early 90s, you trot them out again 20, 25 years later. They look 20, 25 years older. It's not the same. I have said this time and time again, that you can bring them back, but you can't recapture the era because they don't look the same. We don't look the same, but you pull out Kiss 20 years later, you put them back in the makeup, you reinvent, you bring back the big show. It's Kiss again, and it's 1975 again. And their tour with the original lineup in the mid to late 1990s is a massive success. I think the biggest selling tour of 96 or 97, something like that. There is a huge revival of interest in Kiss, as I think these now approaching or in middle-aged people kind of pine for the lost youth. And as rock fans look for the big spectacle again, they timed it just right. And nothing beats bringing back the original lineup, man. That's what the people want to see. It's still what the people want to see. People say, well, Skid Row's new album is pretty good. I actually like some of the songs. You going to go to the show? No. But if Sebastian Bach rejoins and they tour, yeah, you're going to go to the show. Whether he can still sing or not, that's not even the question. It's that people want to see the original thing, no matter how good the new thing might be. So it was with Kiss, and they got the band back together. They managed, to the extent that they could, to bury the hatchets and not in each other's backs. And they played this massive tour, and it did extremely well. And for just a moment in time, it was 1975 again, and I think there were a lot of people who wished it was 1975 again, just like there are a lot of people of my age who wish it was 1988 again, or 1987. Steel Panther captured that so well on that single, 1987. And people really felt that. You read the comments on YouTube for the video for that song, and people are like, you captured it so well. What it would be like to go back to those days. Kiss captured it in the mid to late 90s, bam. And they kept the makeup on, and they kept going. Now, I've heard it said that they had planned to quit after that. After that tour was over, early 2000s, they were like, we're going to pack this in now. But demand remained. And we know Gene Simmons is not going to turn down demand, all right? So Kiss remained, and they kept touring, and they kept playing, and they kept releasing albums. I like the Psycho Circus album. That was one that the original lineup did commensurate with that tour. It was the first time that the original lineup had released something together since the late 70s. I like Psycho Circus. Okay, it did not capture the zeitgeist of that time, was not a grunge record, but it was a great rock album. And I liked some of those songs. And I like Kiss. I like Kiss's music, even though I'm not a giant Kiss fan. And I feel this now. Because, again, they played their last show on the weekend. But Kiss is always thinking forward, Even if it's thinking forward to go backwards, let's put the makeup on again. Because we can see where the opportunity is. And so it comes down to the last song of the last show, which of course is Rock and Roll All Night. And everybody loves Rock and Roll All Night. Come on. And it ends, and thank you, we love you. And then it flashes up. This video starts to play. There's all this dry ice, and this video starts to play. The end of one era is the beginning of a new era. And Kiss announces that Kiss as an entity is not finished at all. But Kiss will go on as avatars. And so the larger-than-life thing gets taken to another freaking level. Kiss will remain intact, I guess, as a virtual band. And they have the technology now. They did this with ABBA. They have the technology now to be able to produce really compelling visuals and holograms and to make a show. And I gather that's what's going to happen. The actual Kiss members, Gene Simmons is 74, Paul is 71. These guys have put in miles. Paul Stanley's had 2 hip surgeries. He has to have more. And he says a lot of the hip trouble is from playing shows in those boots, because those boots have heels that make them giants, right? It's wrecked Paul Stanley's hips. His voice is not what it was, let's be honest. Gene Simmons, 74. It's like this has to end. Even you can put on the face paint and it can look like 75. But if you actually are 75, that's just reality, man. And so Kiss, again, thinking forward and think about, the metaverse. What's the first big show going to be in the metaverse? It might be Kiss's avatars. Who knows, man? But they're already thinking, where do we take this? Because Kiss is a corporation, all right? Kiss is a merchandising machine. You could purchase a Kiss coffin. There is nothing that Gene Simmons will not put that logo on. Here's a fun thing about the logo, by the way. Everybody in North America recognizes the Kiss logo, right? The capital letters, the orange, yellow, capital K, capital I, and then those 2 S's that are lightning bolts. You don't find that in Germany. You don't find that in Israel. You do not find that, I don't think, in Austria. Why? Because those 2 S's look way too much like the stylized SS from the Nazis. The Nazi SS. The Schutzstaffel. And the SS was a wing of the Nazi Party, a militarized wing of the Nazi Party, responsible for a lot of things, including enforcing race policy. So the SS guys were the people who went around rounding up Jews, causing a lot of trouble, and you couldn't use that symbol in those places. It was too reminiscent of the SS, opened up too many very, very deep wounds, just politically not a good thing to do at all. So the Kiss logo in those places looks a little bit different. Those S's are not lightning bolts anymore. They are kind of flat S's. Just an interesting thing, an interesting historical side note. And I can remember being a kid, being in the church, and the rumor was that KISS stood for Knights in Satan's Service, or Kids in Satan's Service, just like AC/DC stood for Antichrist, Devil's Child. If you didn't grow up in that world, then you maybe haven't heard that sort of thing before. Really, really just silly. It didn't mean anything like that. It was just a freaking name, and it was provocative, and it pointed to the raw sexuality that KISS embodied, even in their face paint. Let's not have illusions about what this band was about and what their selling game was. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, even though Gene Simmons never did drugs ever in his freaking life. That was the image, though, right? The God of Thunder, all that stuff, the demon, the star child. Knights in Satan's Service. These guys were not Satanists, man. I was made for loving you, baby. All right, you could argue that the song itself is evil. Like, that's just not a great song. I happen to like that song, but a lot of people are going to argue that it's evil because it was disco. Again, always just trying to take advantage of the zeitgeist a little bit, Kiss. So you could argue on musical terms that song is evil, but come on. Really, Kiss are Satanists? Get real. That's the world I grew up in, though, man. That's the world I grew up in. Where was I going with all of this? Now Kiss is moving forward as these avatars. And I don't know how that will go. That will be an interesting thing, I suppose, to watch from a safe distance. Will anybody go and see a show of Kiss avatars? Or will they put it in like the Sphere at Vegas? Would you go? Would you go see that? Or would you rather have just seen the band? You know, the real thing. It's no surprise to me that Gene and Paul, particularly Gene, are continuing to milk this particular cash cow. But if there was a band that would lend itself to a virtual show, to a hologram show, to a production, to a spectacle like this, of course it's Kiss. Of course it's Kiss. But I saw the avatars and it made me think a little bit of the graphics on Guitar Hero games. Surely it's better than that, but it's kind of what it made me think of. And we'll just see. But for me, you know, I have a certain respect for Kiss, and it's maybe based a bit on nostalgia. Again, I get nostalgic for eras that I did not experience. This is a 50-year career, and you can love them or you can hate them, but you cannot deny the success of that band. And it was not always easy for them to do. Right? Those early days were freaking rough. Those early days are rough for every band for the most part, okay? We have this sort of ethos now, which is go on a TV show and win, and you've got a ready-made career. We found that, in fact, usually doesn't work either. You got to pay your dues. Kiss paid theirs like everybody else, man. They struck at the right time. They struck with the right gimmick and the right songs eventually. And here we have a 50-year career. Here we have like 100 million records sold. Here we have this merchandising machine that I think rivals freaking Disney. I mean, this is really, really a pretty amazing accomplishment, even if you don't like the music. And I know some of you don't because I've talked to you about it. I like the music. I like Kiss. And it's weird for me now to be living in a world where the real Kiss does not exist anymore. But that's the way of it, man. That is the way of it, all right? Those 70s guys are in their 70s now. And the 80s guys and girls will soon follow. We have seen the deterioration of a lot of them. And I think that's just a reality you deal with as you get older. You know, your heroes begin to slip away. Kiss were not my heroes, but they were heroes for a lot of people, man. The Kiss Army was a real thing. And their farewell tour sold out freaking everywhere, man. And that's a heck of a legacy, even if you're not a big Kiss fan. So farewell to you. Farewell to you, Kiss. You done good, man. There was other stuff I was going to say about that, but I think we can just leave it there. Before we go, I want to quickly do a Patreon plug. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, kids of all ages, there is a Patreon page for this podcast. If you're a regular listener, you know my spiel. I started Patreon. It is patreon.com/JohnHuffPodcast because I do not want to run ads on this program. I find ads irritating. I would rather make the monetization voluntary. Thus, Patreon, $5 a month. It's one tier of membership. It's you saying to me, look, Jack, I recognize the work you're putting into this show. I recognize the effort. I recognize the expense, and I want to support you in this way. Patreon.com/JohnHuffPodcast. If you can't do that, if you do not want to do that, that's totally okay. The show will remain free and accessible wherever you enjoy fine podcasts. You can help me by sharing these episodes. Thank you to the people who have done that recently. I so appreciate it. You can help me by leaving ratings and reviews. I just discovered this week that I have a few ratings on Spotify. Thank you so much for those ratings on Spotify. I don't listen to podcasts on Spotify. I listen to them mostly off of Apple. And so I don't spend a lot of time there looking at podcasts. But I was just sort of going through. This is the time of year because the Spotify Wrapped thing came out, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So I just kind of went to check it out. And I've got a few ratings on there, so thank you. If you're a Spotify listener, please leave me a rating there. I would really, really appreciate it. Apple, a rating, a quick review. I haven't had a review in a while, kids. It would warm my cockles this cold December to see a couple of new reviews on the Apple. If you wouldn't mind, if you like what's going on here, if you are being edified, educated, entertained, inspired, motivated in some way, if you're learning about new music, if you're rediscovering old music, please just consider a rating and review, preferably a positive one. And if you can't do the Patreon, that's okay. You can buy my merch still in time for Christmas, john-huff.com/shop. Cool t-shirts, cool mugs, got some cool stuff there. And I just really appreciate the support, kids, all right? I really appreciate you helping me. Thank you so much. Speaking of Spotify Wrapped, interesting, I have this dissonance about Spotify because I recognize that at least on a surface level, you've got this corporation that is making billions, quite literally billions, is pulling in billions off of the art created by musicians and podcasters and paying percentages of pennies on the dollar. And I have cognitive dissonance about that, and I'm not here to get into a debate about whether that's good or bad. The reality is streaming is here and it's not going away. And it has, beginning with freaking Napster and LimeWire 20 years ago, it has just reduced the perceived value of music. And so you have artists now that make nothing on their recordings. Nothing. Handful of pennies, man. And yet at the same time, it provides this vehicle for people, particularly indie bands, to have their music heard. And so it's this double-edged freaking sword. And I don't know what to do about it. I don't like this notion that Spotify makes so much money or pulls in so much money without paying it back, really. And I've heard that they're going to reduce the payments even further. So a lot of artists, I mean, you have to have millions of streams to see any sort of substantial payout from that. And a lot of artists are going to be even getting less than that. And it just seems freaking wrong to me, but it is what it is. And it's here. And it's like you kind of got to be there or whatever opportunity exists passes you by. And then what are you going to do? You're going to sell CDs at your show? Okay, I don't even have a CD player, I don't think, anymore. You know? It's such a hard freaking game. And a lot of artists, especially if they were aspiring to a career in music, are looking around and it's like, I would love to have this career. How am I going to live? How am I going to make enough money to actually live, to have the time to create the art, to be able to pursue this thing? It's never been easy. All right. Even Kiss was broke in the early days. It's never been easy. And it just feels so much harder now. And I know that on some level, Spotify contributes to that. And yet I'm on Spotify too. And I listen to Spotify. And so it's like I get caught up in my own BS on it because I use the service too. And I don't know, but I went to Wrapped. It will come not as a huge surprise that my number one band listened to was The War on Drugs. And my number one song was I Don't Live Here Anymore. And it says I listened to that song 38 times in this past year. I think it's more than that. And I'm not sure if it counts as a stream if you've downloaded the song. I'm not sure. In any case, The War on Drugs was my number one band this year. Hoo-ah. And then a bunch of Collective Evolution songs because I was working up a gig with Collective Evolution. Great band. Go listen to their record. I played on a couple of the songs. What I really want to say about Spotify Wrapped, though, is what it tells me as a podcaster. And I just simply want to say thank you to the handful of you out there for whom this little podcast is your number one. It tells me those things, kids. It tells me where I'm number one. It tells me who has me in the top 10, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to thank all of you who have made me a regular listen on Spotify and everywhere else. Thank you so much, kids. As I've said before, it can feel like I'm speaking into the vacuum, into the void a lot of the time. But then I see that, people have consumed X hundred minutes of my content, whatever it is, and I'm grateful. Thank you so much for that. If it's possible to share via Spotify, which it is, please consider doing that. I thank you so much. I'm going to wrap this thing very, very soon, but just before I do that, just a little RIP to Myles Goodwyn. I was never the biggest April Wine fan either. Had I stayed in Hearts, I would have had a chance, I think, last year to open for April Wine, which would have been really, really freaking cool to do. Again, I missed April Wine. I was just a little bit too young for their heyday as well, but I had older siblings who were into April Wine, and so I was hip to it. And hey, great Canadian band, released some timeless Canadian rock and roll songs, man. And probably my favorite April Wine song, which flew a little bit under the radar. It was later in their career. Every Night I Rock Myself to Sleep. Go listen to Every Night I Rock Myself to Sleep by April Wine, man. This was like a late 80s tune, I want to say. And it's just got drums in it that are not elaborate, but they're so driving. And this is a song to drum to and just hit as hard as you possibly can. I remember hearing this. I feel like I was riding somewhere with my sister, and I don't know where we were going or why. But that tune came on, and we were both just like, the drummer is crushing this. The drummer is all in on this one, man. And Every Night I Rock Myself to Sleep is a somewhat obscure, but really great April Wine song. If you want to curl your lip, if you want to air drum, if you want to get behind your kit and just hit freaking hard, that's the tune to do it to, man. All right. So R.I.P. to Myles Goodwyn. Great singer, great songwriter, great band, the immortal April Wine. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank you as ever for your support. Remember, kids, please do remember. Good things happen when you put yourself out there. Approach this week with the confidence of freaking Gene Simmons, man. If you can do that, you can conquer the freaking world, man. There is nothing you cannot achieve. Thank you ever so much for listening. I'm going to shutting up, except to say, hey, kids, I'll check you later. Yeah. I wanna rock and roll all night and have a wonderful time. Family Guy scene. Go check that out.